Well, welcome everybody to the latest edition of Ed Talks, my podcast. This one I'm particularly interested in because we're talking to the Property Ombudsman. You might have gathered from the logo behind, and this is Rebecca Marsh. And apologies for any noise you hear in the background. We are here at the offices of the Property Ombudsman in Salisbury, so you will hear a little bit of traffic going by outside. But from our point of view, there's plenty to cover, so we might as well get straight into it. When Rebecca took on this job, which was what, 2019, was it? 2020, okay. Auspicious year, obviously. The roles that you've played in the past read like something out of an apocalypse. You've been in the nuclear industry, police, parliament, and I'm sure there's more. So I would love people who are listening to this, who are going to be principal estate agents, to know a little bit more about their property ombudsman. So tell us a little bit more about your past and experience, because there's a lot of it. I mean, you are a very experienced person at adjudicating, from working within the IPCC, which I think is the Independent Police Complaints Commission. So you've had a lot of experience, so just tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, so I've always been interested in problem solving and in improving businesses, because I started life thinking I might want to be an accountant, but decided it was a little boring. And I was working and saw a job advert in the Sunday Times for an Independent Police Complaints Commissioner, and decided I was going to give that a go, because it seemed to bring together for me all of the things that I was interested in, learning from complaints, the real significant challenges, and the opportunity to make a difference. And so I got involved, and that was 20 odd years ago now. So I've been doing this sort of work for 20 years. And the two certainties in life are death and taxes. And those are the two things that I've also been investigating alongside a load of other things. So I was HMRC's commissioner, dealing with misconduct at HMRC for a while when I was at IPCC. So we had the responsibility for misconduct at HMRC. So got involved in all kinds of really interesting and complicated cases. I also, of course, naturally dealt with all kinds of issues around death and destruction and all kinds of challenging.
Yes, at the IPCC, I can imagine, with the police.
Yeah,
with the police,
quite sad. But yeah, so adjudication in many different ways. But my focus has always been about how can we learn. How can the system work better? How can organisations take these experiences and really learn from them? So I did a lot of work at the Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, looking at the health service and how they might learn, looking at how various bits of Parliament, everything from the Environment Agency, HS2 was one of my cases I dealt with, lots and lots of different ways of looking at things. And also things around DVLA and whether or not people should have their driving licences revoked.
That is the most extraordinary experience. So I think most people out there wouldn't know anything about that, about you. And I think the way I want to try and talk about this is that redress has been something which most agents know they have to do, but they want to do it in the cheapest way possible, because that's the way most estate agents think about it. And for those who don't understand, I mean, a lot of people are members of the Property Ombudsman scheme, or indeed the competitor, but they don't necessarily understand how it works. The objective of an ombudsman scheme in this case is, and what redress is all about, is to put people who have a complaint which they cannot get dealt with within the company that they're complaining about. The objective is for them to be put back in the position they were before they made the complaint. So it's not about punishing people or anything like that. That is not what a property ombudsman does, is that right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the challenges that we have is that your average person who finds themselves in difficulty, whether it's, whether somebody has made a mistake or done something wrong or not, comes to us thinking that we're going to fix everything and we're also going to punish people. And of course, that's absolutely not what our role is. We have three aspects to our role. We provide people with information and we direct them and support them to deal with appropriately with their issue, which doesn't always mean that it's a case for us. We might be able to give them the information or correct their misunderstandings so that things don't become a significant issue. We do the redress piece, which is all about putting them back where they should be, had a mistake been made, or equally importantly, reassuring them if a mistake hasn't been made, that what they experienced was the right thing. So building their confidence back in terms of the system and the individual organisation. But the third thing, which is for me is the most exciting and the most important, is we take the learning from all of that and we do something with it, and we feed it back to the organisations, and we feed it back to government, and we feed it back to anybody who'll listen to us to say, if we do this, this won't happen again. And I think even it's wrong to imagine that you can only get learning from where things have gone wrong. Because actually, if somebody comes to us, it's because they've lost trust at some point in the process. Now, that loss of trust may be as a result of an accident, it can be very simple things, but that loss of trust won't be what they complain about, but it will generate the mindset for complaints. So you're more likely to get a complaint about fees if your customer doesn't trust you because of something that's happened earlier in the process.
Let's talk about that trust thing for a moment, because clearly the trust, I've been in the business since 1979, and I don't think trust has ever been worse, actually, to some extent, with estate agents. Do you think it's getting better or worse? You've been in post now for 3 years. I know that certainly with the previous ombudsman, the figures had gone up, the figures in terms of complaints, and I never quite know with complaints whether it's because people publicise the fact that you can complain so they know where to go and they do it, or whether it's because actually the situation is getting worse. Is your experience that trust is getting better or worse since you've been in post?
So I think there's a difference between the complaints and the trust piece. Unfortunately, and I say this having been the legal ombudsman, of course, trust in lawyers and insurance and estate agents, if you look at the scale of things, is very different from the trust you see in terms of judges or doctors or other roles. And other professions more generally. So people are more inclined to trust accountants than they are to trust estate agents. And there's all kinds of stats. And I don't think that that's massively changed. What I do think has happened is that people have become far more aware of their individual circumstances through COVID as much as anything else. But also, we've had so many changes, haven't we? The sector's experienced sort of regulatory and statutory changes as the government's responded to the outcomes of COVID. So we've seen the stamp duty changes, we've seen changes in rules around lettings and whether or not you can evict, and a lot of change, which means it's hard for people to keep up, but it also means it's hard for the individuals who are on the receiving end of those changes to understand where they're at, and therefore they're more inclined to complain because they're sitting in a home and they've seen on the news that this has happened. Well, actually, I'm going to complain about that.
Okay, well, let's talk about the complaining, because one of the issues I've always had is that in our particular sector, for some extraordinary reason, we have competing ombudsmen, and I have no idea why we do that. I'm not here to promote or denigrate or whatever it is, but in principle, the idea of having 2 competing ombudsmen within the same sector, that surely doesn't make a huge amount of sense, does it?
No, and actually, technically, there aren't competing ombudsmen. There are competing redress schemes, one of which is an ombudsman. And so the nature of the service is very different, because in order to be an ombudsman, you have to meet the criteria of the Ombudsman Association. And one of the Ombudsman Association rules is you can't have more than one ombudsman in the sector, because it's not in the interest of anybody to do so. The ombudsman needs to be completely independent and to be able to make judgments that cannot be influenced. If you throw competition into the mix, you can get situations where there are perceived or real conflicts of interest.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I can see that it's very, very difficult, and people, your customers are the estate agents. They're the people that are paying, your clients. They're the ones that are actually paying the bills, if I can put it like that. And the objective of certainly the Property Ombudsman scheme is not to make money. It's a non-profit, so if there's a surplus, it goes back into learning, etc., etc. And I know that I know perfectly well that you're always looking for more efficient ways of running the business. As you just said at the beginning, it's one of the things you enjoy is trying to improve the business, and your accountancy not past will hopefully help you in that. But it's always confused me because, as I said, I know, as you mentioned earlier, being an ombudsman is not redress is not regulation. And I think a lot of people have a problem with that, or not a problem, but they don't understand that you're not a regulator. You are someone there that's just to try and put people who complain that they can't sort out back in the same position they were before, or at least look at it gives them an opportunity to hand it over if they can't deal with it themselves and say, right, you make a decision and we'll abide by it. But when you've got, my imagination in this is always that, or my feeling has always been that there should be one person who does that in each sector. And I can sort of see why the government does it, because they think, oh, great, they'll compete and price and all that, they'll keep the prices down and all that. But I still worry that there are a number of people who will switch between redress schemes for the wrong reason, that they're doing it just because it's cheaper. And I don't think a lot of them understand what comes out of, certainly the Property Ombudsman. So tell us a little bit about what comes out. You mentioned earlier that there's learnings that come out that you put back to government and to the agents, etc., etc. Tell us a bit more about, well, justify the fee, if I can put it like that.
Yeah.
I mean, people are paying £262, I think it is a year, isn't it, per branch at the moment? So,
our fees cover our inquiries function. They cover depending on your fee structure and your arrangements, which we are transparent about, I have to say, and they cover that sort of feedback and learning piece. And I think that's a really crucial element of it. But if we take the front end, we probably have of our 40 to 50,000 contacts, around about 5,000 of those.
That's annual.
That's annual.
Right.
Round about 5,000 of those, which if we were running as a pure redress scheme, would be cases. But because we intervene at that early stage and we have those conversations, we're often able to deal with those things without it ever even crossing the agent's desks. Because what we can say is, you've misunderstood or whatever,
okay.
Or we can enable them to have a conversation with the agent that allows the agent to deal with the matter. It's not, so if there is a mistake, we can be really clear with the individual about the scope and scale.
Okay, so a large chunk people never hear about.
So it's a large chunk of stuff. Now, if you were doing that on a case by case basis and you were just doing a pure redress scheme, that would come in as cases
and be charged.
Yes. So you've got that piece of work, which I think is beneficial. The thing that gives us as well, though, of course, is that volume and those interactions at that front end give us tremendous intelligence on what's happening in the sector, which again you wouldn't have as a redress scheme because you'd be missing that chunk out. Now, as you said, we've not got shareholders, we've not got people that we have to be accountable to for making a profit. Our business is about making sure that we do our best for the sector. That's the role of the Ombudsman. The role of the Ombudsman in relation to regulators and governments is as a critical friend. So we're not representing the sector per se, but what we are doing is saying to government and to regulators where they
feeding back intelligence.
Is saying, well, hang on a minute, you've got this in place, this is the impact of it.
No, I get that. And again, it's a slightly loaded question probably. Do you think £262 gives them, is value?
Well, of course. I mean, you'd be unsurprised to hear me say otherwise. But I think it's also a little bit about, and one of the things that we're doing a lot of work on at the moment, is how we enhance the feedback to the individual organisations, but also provide more support to our members. So we've got a strand of work at the moment that's underway, looking at how do we do more in terms of providing the output from that insight directly to our members in a way that they can engage with. Because at the moment we can provide it, but it's a bit sort of global. Actually,
well, it is global, but it's included in your fees. I mean, I think a lot of people don't understand. It's no coincidence that the opposing redress scheme has very similar charges, to be honest, and they tend to charge on a case by case basis. So the moment it may be upfront slightly cheaper, but then you get the case fees on top, which of course, as you said, if you were charging for all the ones that you have just dealt with beforehand, would be costing. So, but it's pretty telling, I think, that the fees overall end up being about the same. So it's clearly about the right sort of price. I don't think people in the industry need to feel that there's any. I mean, how can you for £262 for a year? It's not exactly a huge amount of money, but for estate agents at the moment, this is particularly valid because a lot of them are suffering at the moment.
Yeah.
You know, they're looking at what do they do about staff, etc., etc. However, unfortunately, we're not here to talk about that. We're not here to talk about estate agents having a difficult time. We're trying to make their lives easier. And one of the things that you mentioned about earlier, or we talked about briefly earlier, was the number of different ombudsmen in the different sectors. Now, if anyone wants an idea in confusion, just tell us about your situation where you live at the moment and someone who lives on the estate that you live on.
Yes, so I live on an estate in a freehold property, but my garage is a leasehold. We have an estate management company, we have a community interest company, we have housing associations own a fair number of the properties. We have private rented and housing association rented. And any of us who have garages, our garage is a leasehold, and our landlord has an agent who is an agent acting on behalf of the social housing owner of those particular properties. So you've got social housing, you've got freeholders, you've got estate management on behalf of the freeholders, you've got estate management on behalf of the leaseholders and the housing association, you've got people who are private rented people on the estate. And I was saying to you earlier, wasn't I, about one of my neighbours who is in social housing, who in COVID couldn't get her children into her back garden because her back door was broken. But because of the complex layers between her and the person who was ultimately responsible in terms of the freeholder and getting that property fixed, it took so long. And there were so many people who in that chain were themselves frustrated and under pressure. So you've got at least two agents involved in that, as well as the various other roles in terms of leasehold and freeholders. And that was just a lot of people who were all struggling to achieve an outcome, and nobody was succeeding. And actually it was because of supply issues. But it's so complex, and how you get a simple problem to become such an emotive issue and so difficult.
Well, let's use that as an example for a second. So you've got within that, you've got block management, you've got social housing, different ombudsmen there, you've got at the very least 3 or 4 different potential people to go to for redress. One of the questions I love to ask is about if you had a magic wand and you were just waving it around. So people in this world, particularly about problems in politics or problems, all they focus on is the problems. They never say, they go, oh, we've got problems with aerated concrete, why don't we rip it all down and do this instead? They just complain about it. So if you had a magic wand, how would you sort that? Can you have one ombudsman overseeing everything? Could you have an overarching umbrella organisation with an ombudsman at the top who then talks to because the skill set involved in social housing or block management, are they so different that an ombudsman couldn't handle all of it?
No, I mean, ombudsmanry is ombudsmanry. I mean, you can tell from the various sectors in which I've operated. I had to learn about tax, I had to learn about policing, I had to learn about nuclear, I had to learn but the basic skill set of understanding there's a problem, there's a mechanism for solving that problem. And I think also that the focus not on punishment but on learning and improvement allows you to apply a series of principles to an issue that, you
But it doesn't matter which sector it's in.
It doesn't matter which sector it's in. The important thing is that you understand what you're trying to achieve as the outcome at the end, which is often what gets lost.
Which normally is?
Well, it's normally to put things right and to stop them happening again. So what you're trying to do is say, what went wrong? How do we fix it? Sometimes you can't fix it, so you have financial compensation or you have an appropriate response that's an alternative to being able to put somebody back exactly where they should have been.
Which is what briefly jumping back to your role and what happens within the Property Ombudsman scheme, which is what the awards are there for.
Yes.
When you're talking to an estate agent.
Yes.
I mean, just give us some idea, because of course people tend to look at the headlines and think, oh my God, the maximum award is what, 25,000 or whatever it is. But the average award that you award is...
Well, it's very low. It varies sector to sector, and I think because averages, because of the volumes we deal with, actually don't tell you much.
Okay.
But if you're talking a few £100 largely for most people, for most issues, and that is often split between a recognition of the actual costs and putting things right, but also the distress and inconvenience piece.
Yeah.
Now that's something that's really quite interesting to talk about, Ed, because one of the challenges we have from members is that they want a formulaic approach. So, if we get this wrong, it'll cost us this. Whereas the reality is you're going to put somebody back where they should have been. So if I give you a very, very simple example of that, if access to property, so I'm moving into a property, I can't get in now. And it's the fault of the agent, I can't get in. 3 or 4 hours, I'm going to be stuck. It's hot. For me, I might have my laptop, I might be able to go into the local cafe, sit and work for 3 or 4 hours. It's annoying, it's inconvenient. Does it have a massive impact on me? Not really. On the other hand, I'm sat there with my demented mother and my pussycat in a thing and a 6-month-old baby. I can't let my mother out the car because she's so confused and she needs to be in my new property. My baby needs feeding, the cat's getting really, really hot, can't be let out because it's scorching outside. I can't afford air conditioning in my car. The impact that 3 or 4 hours is going to have on me in that state compared to the impact it might have on me, if I were me, for example, I'd be off with my laptop sat somewhere working until I was ready. It's tremendously, and that's just a simple example of difference. And so what you've got to do is recognise the differences, and that's why we don't give people formulas, because the impact on people and putting them back where they should have been is different in individual circumstances.
Now, I can completely get that, and that's a very simple example, and I'm sure I would just like to say before agents, I know most agents have problems with solicitors not being completed at the right time, but that's about communication and organisation. And I think, I always remember one of the things that Ombudsmen have said over the years to me, which is that the principal problems tend to be because of a lack of record keeping and communication. And I think those are always the two things, aren't they, that keep coming to the fore.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the other thing that I would often say though is, and we've been having some conversations, haven't we, in the sector more generally about leasehold and common hold and all of those sorts of things. But one of the things that I always say is, this is all about people. You can have process, you can have all this. Ultimately, it's down to people and people's behaviour. And the more you understand the things that trigger confidence and engagement, and the more so communication is a prime example, and the more you recognise and are operating in an empathetic way, the less likely you are to have trouble. Because so often miscommunication, if there isn't a trust basis there for somebody to come back and ask you that question because they've not understood it, you've lost it, and you can lose it big time down the line, because that just multiplies through the process.
Yeah, of course it does. I mean, communication is what it's all about. I mean, my amazement to some extent is that in a community where we have, 1 million sales transactions a year, God knows how many rental transactions, actually the figures that end up, and I remember from having been at Douglas and Gordon, dealing with complaints, we very quickly realised that people just wanted normally an apology and perhaps some kind of financial recompense, very minor normally, something just exactly as you said, just for the lack of convenience or the problem. But really the figures are very low for the figures that end up coming through.
Yeah.
The vast majority, whatever it is, 95% of transactions go through without anybody complaining. That doesn't mean they're not stressful, but in terms of actually doing something where they feel the agent, which is who we're representing in this, or you're representing in this, is at fault. So it's mostly pretty good, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think if you were talking about things getting more difficult and the increase in complaints. And I do think that the pressure and the competition in the sector at the moment, not, you know, you're talking about competition between ombudsmen, but actually it's quite it's heated up, hasn't it, the competition levels in the sector, particularly in sales, with the availability of properties and the, you know, the desire. It's moved a lot, and we've seen some real swings, haven't we, over the last few years that have been.
Well, I think the biggest swings, and I perhaps will sort of come to an end on this, because I think you know, I'm very conscious of the fact that you've been a fantastic person to interview, because we've just sort of talked and it's all flowed very naturally. But there are some big changes coming in the industry, particularly, as you say, in sales. Rental is a different thing, because we've got the Renters Reform Bill, some of which drives me mad, but we're not going to talk about that because we can go into that, and I don't think that's not our remit. I'm here to try and humanise you, is the wrong word, but I want people to understand what it is you do and how experienced you are. What do you think the effect is going to be of this increase in what people perceive as being the sort of broker model for agencies, so the more personal brands? We know that 75% of all estate agents are small one-office operations, and they can be very difficult to get the message to. Now, the fact of the matter is the vast majority of those are members of the Property Ombudsman scheme, so you have a great opportunity to communicate with these people. Do you think having people operating on their own as a broker model, their own personal brand, do you think that's likely to make life easier for consumers? Do you think those sort of people are going to be good, but perhaps the increase in the online estate agency type, the purple bricks model, that sort of thing? I mean, obviously that's changing a little bit. Do you think the changes that are happening in agency are going to make your life easier or more difficult?
Well, it's always, isn't it, so much easier to translate learning into a structured organisation, because you've got that opportunity to say and to put processes in place and to put safety nets in the business itself, so that you can manage those things. So if you've got learning, it's easier to get it. It has always been a challenge for ombudsmen, whether they, you know, when I was the legal ombudsman, most of the interactions were with individual solicitors. They weren't with big firms or big structured organisations. And actually, when you are building a business, the time to take out to learn is a real challenge. So what we need to do in response to that changing model is think about how we make things accessible, bite-sized and appropriate, so that the interactions with us and those members become more effective over time as things move on. So I think it will be more challenging in the short term, because people will be trying to you know, if you're an individual trying to run a business, just staying on top of the changes to legislation.
Just,
you know,
about to say that.
It's a massive challenge. And one of the arguments I have, to be fair, with trading standards on a regular basis is most people want to do the right thing. If they've made a mistake, it's often a genuine mistake. It isn't an intention to, you know, disadvantage anybody.
Yeah.
If you work on that basis, what you don't do is punish people for mistakes. What you do is find ways of helping them be compliant, helping them do what they need to do. And you don't do that by overburdening them. I mean, you know.
No, do you know what? I think that's a fantastic place to stop. I do think that with an increasing number of people promoting personal brands, the idea that they can come to the Property Ombudsman, which they will be a member of, and get the information which will help them comply, understand what legislation is, that is perfect to me. It's a really good resource for them to use. And frankly, for the grand total of £262 for a year, that sounds like an absolute bargain to me. But I mean, I'm not here to try and sell it. I just think that as a resource, which is the way I've always looked at it, people who are operating on their own without the backup of an office, trying to run a business, they've got enough going on running the business without worrying about the legislation, or let alone on the letting side, which is immediate. I think we've talked about a lot here. I really hope people who listen to this understand more now about you and about what an ombudsman is, how they can get more out of you and out of your team. So, Rebecca, thank you so much for your time. and I look forward to hearing more about what's coming up and how you're going to react to things down the road.
Thanks, sir.